Brendon O'Connor is an Associate Professor in American Politics with the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He joins us live on the phone. And what is your opinion of what has been announced today by Tony Abbott?
Well, it's getting out in front of many other nations. I mean, I couldn't find information about the French or the Canadians, or certainly not the British, who you might have expected sending troops already. So I've referred to this in an academic article I wrote a few years ago as the kind of hound dog thesis, that Australia isn't a lapdog here. It isn't sort of doing exactly what the US would say it wanted, but rather getting out in front and making a case to say Australia is a kind of dependable, maybe even over-enthusiastic ally. And I think we see this pattern in the Vietnam War, we see it in the 2003 Iraq War, and I think there's a case saying we can see it now.
And Brendon O'Connor, crucially, the difference this time is that there is a sense that this is a regional solution, that Arab countries are also involved.
I think there's a genuine sort of want for this to be multilateral, which is great from the Obama administration. And there's been, the right things have been said, I think, by Egypt, by a number of other countries. But in terms of what that practically means, I mean, this is a very big question. Iran is already fighting in Iraq. It probably already has troops there. How they're going to coordinate with the United States and Australia, incredibly complex question. And then will other nations actually send any forces in? How could various armies fight together? I think that's in some ways unlikely. So I think in general there's not many people putting their hands up and saying ISIS is a good thing, but practically how it can be defeated or even halted for a while is much, much more complicated.
You're talking about armies coming into contact and fighting with and against each other. Does that indicate that there is an inevitability about Australia's role there becoming much deeper and greater?
Well, one of the tricky points here is that the want will be to train Iraqi forces. But Iraqi forces have been trained since about 2003 when Saddam was kind of deposed, or his army was deposed. So there's almost been probably 10 years of training these forces. Probably 120,000 Iraqi forces recently fought against maybe 20,000 ISIS forces and were routed. So the history of training these forces is not particularly sort of encouraging. And the idea that forces might be able to be trained in Syria also to defeat the Assad government, it just doesn't seem that likely. Obama, in fact, said training moderate forces in Syria a couple of months ago was a fantasy to be able to defeat Assad. So I don't exactly know what's changed. I think recent history would suggest that they can be defeated, these ISIS forces, for a while, like the Sunni uprising was able to defeat an Anbar forces in what was called the Surge around 2007. But that these forces could reappear in 2 or 3 years' time, so it might only be a temporary victory.
So it's hard to know what success would look like, Mr O'Connor. If we turn to the US now, though, the polling there has increasingly shown that Americans are coming on board with action there. What has been behind that surge in support for this?
The beheading of these journalists. I mean, it's a remarkable story again that in wars, if you've got graphic images of something that looks like brutality, and it clearly is, public opinion can be changed. I mean, it's a story that we can date back to many wars. We take the First World War, which we have the anniversary of in many regards. This, 100-year anniversary this year. There were images, there were stories of Belgian babies being slaughtered by Germans, and this invoked a great deal of sort of, disgust, and it went around the world, and it drew forces in from, of course, Australia and New Zealand into that war. And I think it's a similar story here, that those images, a sense that this is a barbarous force, a brutal force, that the way that that's caught on as a story is quite remarkable. Now, it is, I mean, it's true in many regards, but there are also many sort of terrible things happening, say, today in Nigeria with kidnappings, or in southern Sudan. So there are other places that terrible things are going on. It's amazing how this story in some ways has captured the global imagination.
So that's quite remarkable. Just to recap there, of course, in war, so many lives are lost, but you're saying once those personal stories come through, and as we've seen with these beheadings, that's enough to really change public support.
Well, it seems to. I mean, the polling, if you look at it, is quite, is supportive of something being done, which is a human emotion, is understandable. But I suppose if you look back at the history of the Iraq War, there's a long period of people saying, let's wash our hands of it. let's keep away from the Middle East, let's keep away from Iraq. So the fact that that's turned around, I think it's partly to do with a different president being in power, that people in some ways think Obama won't be sending in ground troops, he's going to do it differently. But I think there is this sort of basic human sort of want to do something, particularly when the media gets onto a story like this and it's involved journalists, which probably makes it a stronger media story, that people have a sense that something should be done.
Brendon O'Connor from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.